Chapter 8, War Over Slavery, 1858 to 1867. What comes to mind when you think about Abraham Lincoln? 1, he was very tall. 2, he wore a big black hat. 3, we call him Honest Abe. 4, he, quote, freed the slaves. Well, it's not quite that simple. Things never really are. People are complicated and flawed. Like, remember how Thomas Jefferson said, all men are created equal, but was also an enslaver who wrote racist ideas? Well, Abraham Lincoln said a lot of contradictory stuff too. Like rope tied to a kite, he seemed to sway in different directions depending on where the wind blew. Think about something you really wanted. A dog, a cell phone, a new video game. Maybe you made promises and did everything you could to persuade an adult to get it for you. Like, I promise to walk the dog every day, twice a day. You made those promises even if you really didn't believe them yourself. You were only thinking, what can I say to get the thing I want? Lincoln was a lot like that. Except the kinds of promises he was making were about people's lives. Before he ran for president, Lincoln tried to become a senator by becoming anti-slavery but not anti-racist. Here's what that meant. Lincoln said he wanted slavery to end. Great. Lincoln said he didn't think black people should be treated as equal to white people. Not great. Lincoln said slavery should end because if labor continued to be free, it would be bad for poor white people. Since they were too poor to own people, they would need to work. But how could they work if no one needed their labor because of enslavement? So it wasn't because slavery was horrible that Lincoln wanted it to end. He wanted to end it to help poor white people find work and make money. None of this worked for enslavers. They, of course, did not want slavery to end. They wanted to remain wealthy, and because they had the power, Lincoln lost. So, to win the presidency, Lincoln made a different promise, a promise that would get racists to vote for him. That promise? He would stop all this talk about ending slavery. Lincoln won. But even with this promise, enslavers didn't trust Lincoln. They didn't see him as Honest Abe at all. They worried that Lincoln was a threat to their wealth. They worried about more revolts by enslaved people. And so the southern states decided to break away from the nation and create their own separate territory. This territory, known as the Confederacy, would be led by its own president, someone who they believed would protect their wealth and their way of life. And to be clear, their way of life was slavery. America was now a country split in half, two separate unions, each with its own flag, each operating with its own set of rules and laws, and each wanting the other to act a certain way. This was a big problem. And in 1861, a huge fight began over this division. This civil war was not between America and another country, a war within our own country, Americans versus Americans. Let's pause. Today, there are people in history books that claim that the Civil War was not about slavery, and that symbols from this time, such as the Confederate flag and monuments of leaders of the Confederacy, are about Southern pride. But the honest truth is the fighting, the war, the symbols, and the monuments are about white supremacy and racial terror. Today, many of those symbols and statues are being removed from public spaces because what they represent is that the Southern states, the Confederacy, did not want to give up slavery and the wealth and power it gave them, and they were willing to battle and shed blood to protect this. To get the chance to fight against the thing that had been terrorizing them for centuries, enslaved people risked their lives and took any chance to run away to join the Union Army. At first, Union soldiers sent them right back, enforcing the Fugitive Slave Act, which said all runaway enslaved people had to be returned to their enslavers. But all that changed in the summer of 1862. The Union declared that those who escaped slavery to join the war would be, quote, forever free. Then Lincoln made an even bigger declaration that all enslaved people in Confederate areas would now be free. But you see the problem there? Lincoln's declaration did not free all enslaved people, only those in Confederate areas. Enslaved people in other parts of the country would have to wait for the 13th Amendment, which ended slavery throughout the United States. For emancipated people who were now, quote, free, freedom was complicated. Black people did not have the power to live fully without limitations, to determine their own destiny. They were still caught in the tangled rope of racism. To be free. Why was freedom complicated? Americans had a lot of ideas about what freedom meant and who freedom was for. The president of the Confederacy, a man named Jefferson Davis, said that inequality between black and white people was, quote, stamped from the beginning, meaning that black and white people never were and never could be considered equal. 4 years after the Civil War started, the battle between the North and the South was over. The North had won, and all enslaved people were declared, quote, free, but freedom still felt far away because 1. Black people were free, but they didn't have a place to go. They didn't have land of their own. 2. Black people were free, but they didn't have a way to earn money and build a life for themselves. 3. Black people were free, but they didn't have the tools white people had, such as access to schools or family money or privilege. 4. Black people were free, but they weren't allowed to vote. 5. Black people were free, but that didn't change how white people felt about them or treated them. The South may have lost the war, but people were not willing to surrender their racist ideas.